Hello fellow humans and welcome to Computer Science for Humans. My name is Reagan and today we are talking about 5 tips that you can use to easily and quickly improve your programming. These are all really easy to implement and make a huge difference in your code once you start using them. You will notice as we go through these tips that they all have to do with making your code clear and easy to read. That's because doing that is so important to having high quality code that's easy to maintain, easy to use for you and for other people into the future. Let's jump right in. So for our first tip, we have easily the most important tip you will ever get about writing good code, and that is use good variable names. Using good variable names is the baseline for writing good code. If you don't have good variable names, you don't have good code no matter what else you do. It might work, but it's not going to be readable. No one's going to be able to use it. If you don't believe me, go into one of your old programs or one of your new ones if you want, and replace all of the variable names with words that don't mean anything, like Donald Duck or Mickey Mouse or Jedi or Sith or things like that. And then wait a few days, come back to the code and see how easy it is to figure out what it does. It's not easy. So what can you do to improve the quality of your variable names? I'm glad you asked. Here are some sub-tips for you to help get you on the right direction with variable names. First, use more than one letter in your variable name, please. I'm tired of seeing E and C as variable names. There's occasionally a reason to do that, but it's very, very rare. Like maybe if you're doing Einstein's equations like E equals mc squared, okay, use E, M, C and stuff, right? But please stop using one-letter variable names. And 3-letter variable names are not much better, Golang. Looking at you. But in all seriousness, one-letter variable names don't tell you anything. A variable named C is just as useful as a variable named Bob or Jim, whatever other random words you Sauron. I don't know. You get the idea. Related to that, use full words. If you're using any editor or an IDE worth salt, what a weird saying, then it will autofill words for you. There's no reason not to just type the whole word the first time when after that you can type half the word or less sometimes. Just press tab or enter and then it fills it for you. And as long as you're not using one-letter variable names, you might as well use, I don't know, words, like a whole word, like those things we grow up using to each other. This may sound kind of ridiculous, but seriously, I've seen some weird variable names in my time, okay? People don't put any effort into their variables or they name it wrong. So when you make your variables, use more than one letter, preferably the whole word, or if you need to, an entire sentence. After all, when you have something like Visual Studio Code, IntelliJ, Visual Studio, not Code, probably Xcode, or any other editor, Sublime Text might even do it, I don't know. When your code editor will fill in the name for you after typing 2 or 3 letters, there's no reason not to type the whole word or the whole concept that you need. I'm not saying you should use like a novel for every name of a variable, but there's no excuse to use a single letter or 3 letters or an abbreviation for the variable name unless it's so common and ubiquitous to use that's basically the name of it anyway. But usually don't. Just write the whole word. Way clearer. Tip number 2 for improving your code is going to sound a lot like tip number 1. Function names. You can see where I'm going with this. If you intentionally name your functions, just like with variables, they're easier to read. Much easier to read, in fact. So just like with variables, where we don't want to use variable names like Bob or C or E, don't do that with functions either. Now, thankfully, most people at least try to use words in their function name. There's also a lot of people who like to put function names like callback. That doesn't really tell me anything about why the function exists. Why? All that to say, you need a function name that tells you something about the function, something useful about the function. Just like with variables. If you just do the first 2 tips, be intentional about your variable names and don't be lazy, be intentional about your function names and don't be lazy, you're already miles ahead of most other programmers in the field. Most people don't take more than 2 or 3 seconds to think about what they're going to name a variable or a function. But if you want to start taking it to the next level, this next tip is a little bit more advanced, but still very easy to implement in your code. And that is actually use functions. There's probably a lot of people right now who are like, That's not advanced. And yeah, exactly. Joking aside though, what I'm specifically talking about is how most people, when you're writing code, it's pretty easy for your functions that you do have to get really, really big, like 700 lines of code in a single function. But what you really want to do in order to keep your code readable and easy to actually use for other programmers, including yourself in the future, is you want to make your functions as compact as possible. Think about it like if you're building a laptop, right? You don't just throw every part at random into the computer. There's a lot of space management, and there's a lot of that goes into programming as well, but you're not really taught it in the schools a lot of the time. So most people don't realize it's there, but space management is a real thing. It just so happens that in your code editor, you have as much space as your computer can hold, but that doesn't mean that you should just use all of that space. You want to keep it compact enough that your mind can hold it too, at least as much as possible. And you're never going to be able to hold a whole project in your mind, especially not all at once, which is why it's so important to break things up into small, compact pieces that you can understand by itself without having to worry about literally everything else in the code. And this touches on a lot more advanced topics too that I will cover in future videos. For now, if you just every once in a while, if you see a really big function that you have, take a look at it, see if you can split it into two, or just take a section of it and pull it out into its own function. A lot of the time that actually makes the code a lot easier to handle, and you'll find yourself being more able to read the code as you go. All right, so for this next tip, we're getting a little bit more advanced. It's still not hard to implement. It's just that if you do this, you're actually doing something that maybe 3 or 4% of professional developers actually do. A lot of people wish they would do this, but don't have the discipline to actually sit down and do it. And that is revisit your past code. So what do I mean by revisit your past code? Specifically, what I'm talking about is looking back at an old project. The further back you go, the better, and closely examine it to see what you can improve. For example, maybe there are some bad variable or function names that you can change around to make a lot clearer. Maybe the organization is just a mess. If you're like me, when I first started college, I know my code started out as a mess. And I actually still enjoy going back to those projects every once in a while to see what I can improve and make better. But going back and actually revisiting your code with an intention to improve it and examine it, much like an author reading a book to edit it. It's kind of the same idea there. It helps you in several ways with your programming. First, it's an awesome way to see how far you've come, and you can look back and be like, wow, I actually wrote that before? Okay, I know now this is actually not the best way to do that. I should do it this way. But on top of that, it can be really helpful to just go through one of those projects and upgrade it. It helps you get practice on how you can more efficiently write code when you go back on something that you already are somewhat familiar with, but it's been a while, and you can more easily see what needs to change and what needs to improve. Because programming is a lot more like writing a novel or a story of some kind than most people realize. In a novel, no one would dream of publishing, most people wouldn't dream of publishing a novel without getting a professional editor. But with coding, there's this kind of feel that once you write it, you're just done. But it's still writing, and we're even writing in a language. I think that's kind of silly. So review your code, see what you can improve, see how far you've come, and find some ways to clean it up. Our last tip is, in my opinion, the most important thing you can do to take your programming to the next level. And that is practice. Intentional practice. I don't mean just like randomly goofing around programming. I specifically mean practice similar to what football players would do during their practice. They work out, they practice drills, and they repeat repeatable skills so that they can become fluent in that skill and not have to think about exactly how to throw the ball. They can do it intuitively. This level of intuition is actually very achievable in programming, but most people don't realize that because they've never practiced in a way to gain it. And luckily for us, the practice you need to do to gain that level of intuition is actually pretty simple to do. But like most drills, most people don't do them because it can be seen as kind of boring sometimes. The drill I want to introduce you to today is one that I call the Lego house drill. And it is a drill that completely changed my programming life. It changed the way I think about code and the way I write code and the way I read code. And it's my favorite drill to teach people. I teach it to all of my students. The way you do this drill is you pick a project that you want to do, preferably a very, very simple project, not more than say 3 or 4 functions max. although you can make it more complex as you get more used to this drill. And you take that project and you make it from scratch. And when I say from scratch, I mean completely from scratch. You can use all the tools you normally would, but start from the very beginning, new project, and then following the prompts for whatever IDE you have, completely blank slate. Once you have that finished, look it over, make sure it's actually finished, run it, all that stuff, and then delete it. Once you've deleted it, start from scratch again. If you do this just like 2 or 3 times, you're going to become very familiar with the entire process of everything in that project. And as you practice this more, add more and more things that you don't really feel fully comfortable with in your programming. For example, a lot of people don't feel super comfortable creating a new project in their IDE. Do that over and over. A lot of people don't feel particularly comfortable creating the baseline for an API in JavaScript. Now that one's a little bit bigger, but it's still something that you can use the Lego House drill on to become proficient with it. And I know it sounds weird to make something and then delete it, and then make something and delete it again. And I know it's hard to delete code you've worked on. If you really don't want to delete it, you could do it in a separate folder so that you have each iteration of it, and that can be cool for seeing your progress as you go. But as you do this, keep in mind, part of the point is also to try to do it a little bit better each time. Maybe you're doing it a little faster the second time, and on the third time, maybe you use code that's a little clearer or a little bit more concise. Maybe the third time you try it using a different technique you've never used. The purpose is learning. This isn't something for school, this is for you. And so keep that in mind as you work. For today's last tip, we have remove your comments. Yes, you heard me. Delete the part of your code that exists only to explain your code. Let me explain. You see, comments at their core are fine, but at their core, they are also clutter. They are the only code that doesn't do anything. You have literally lines and lines and lines of code that are completely useless to the computer. They're notes to the developer. So the reason I'm urging you to delete your comments, and I'm sure I'll have a full rant video on this later, is because even though comments are fine, the way you're using them probably is not. Most people are taught a bad way to use comments, which is basically to have this whole conversation with other developers inside the code. And there's a lot of code that if you look at it, it's 90% comments sometimes. And that makes it really hard to just kind of skim over the code and see what does it do. You have to read a novel of conversations between developers. And then there are all the comments that have nothing to do with any of that and are just notes to self that weren't deleted at some point. Do yourself a favor, delete your comments. If you're not comfortable fully deleting all your comments without at least thinking about it first, and that's fine, thinking is good, then there's a pretty easy test you can do to see whether or not your comment is necessary. Ignore your comment, go down to the code that it's commenting, look at that code. If you can understand it without the comment, then delete the comment. I can't tell you how many times I've seen someone write a function called something like login, and then on top of that function, they have a big long comment that says, this function logs into the system. And it's like, yeah, it's called login. And that brings me to one other point. If you're naming your variables and your functions properly, then a lot of the comments you would normally use become completely unnecessary because the variable and the function explain themselves. And similarly, if you have a comment that is absolutely necessary to explain a line of code, maybe that line of code is just sloppy. So I hope you found all these tips useful. I know they helped me as I was making my programming journey. Let me know down in the comments below if you agree or disagree or anything in between, or if you have other tips you'd like to add as well. And I hope to see you in the next video. I don't know what's next.